Like, look, when generative AI came out, like the first thing people were like, "Oh, graphic designers are going to be gone." No, if anything, they're going to be. It's just like when computers were brought out and librarians are like, "Oh, we're all going to lose our jobs." It actually created more librarian jobs because somebody needs to manage this stuff. Like now that generative AI is out there, I mean, I'm a business owner. I'm not going to go and spend time like prompting an AI to come up with a new logo or some kind of design. Like the designer's going to do that. They're just going to be a lot more efficient at their job and they're going to be better at it. I think. Would you agree with
Yeah,
that?
it's to an extent. I think the one thing is a couple of years ago there was a real article. It was I believe he's a social economist of some kind, and he was from MIT, and it called "On Bullshit Jobs," and basically said there's all these jobs that
What
are
a great, that's a
unfulfilling.
great. Is that a podcast or a blog?
I think it was in like the Atlantic or something, but he
That's
turned it into a
I
book.
gotta look into that. Okay, okay. Sorry,
Yeah.
continue.
So anyway, he said, I've written stuff for 25 years and nothing has ever struck a chord like this. Like he got invited, the speaker circuit, all this stuff. And basically what it was is the idea was that there were all these jobs out there that didn't have a need to exist. So like, yeah, we pay teachers and nurses not what they're worth in our society, which is a terrible thing. But there's no question to a teacher that what they do is important, right?
Mm-hmm.
No question. There's no question. Nurses, what they do is important. We see these things. We see that what happens when society is forced to go inside. Who really matters and who is kind of just not to say everyone who went inside but didn't matter because obviously I was one of those people. But the answer is what you realize is there's all these people whose job it is to like redline corporate contracts, and now maybe you don't need that anymore, right? Because you can get one person to do the job of five people. So that's the people I think are going to be most at risk is people who are superfluous. But having said that, of course, what you can do, just like social media generated all these people whose job, my for example, my 2-year-old watches this show called Like Nastia, and she's apparently making $62 million a year doing, children's programming. I'm like, I went in the wrong job, obviously.
Seriously,
That
yeah.
was completely created out of YouTube, right? So yeah, YouTube made certain types of media obsolete or at least difficult to maintain, but it all of a sudden opened up a whole different industry.
Yeah, these platforms, what's exciting about them is like we have no idea the network effect that they're going to have on job creation. It's kind of like in the 1900s when they introduced like highways and superhighways. We knew that it was going to have an effect on transportation. We had no idea how it was going to bring like fast food, all these other things that had like a ripple effect. I feel like look, YouTube's a great example of that, right? I mean,
well, and that's one of the things we think about ourselves as in the long term, right? So right now, it's not that if you look at mental health care, right, it's notoriously underfunded. It's like psychiatry is
yeah,
notoriously
that was like the number one
expensive.
issue that came out of the pandemic, and like nobody's really talking about it much, right?
Well, I think what it gets down to is you have to think about the industry has fundamentally changed. And a good example, there's a wonderful Vice documentary on this about healthcare, mental health care in China. But I think it's true to the U.S. extent as well. And they said one of the things that happened after the pandemic in China was it went from nobody talked about mental health unless you needed to be in the hospital. And that's what the system was scaled for, too. All of a sudden, it became like the West overnight. Like China always adopts everything at the end result of the U.S.'s technological cycle. And so now there's this huge, their ratio of psychiatrists to people in the population is one psychiatrist for every 165,000 people. And given that a third of those people would probably have some kind of mental health issue, you're talking about enormous, impossible ratios to fill, and how the private sector all of a sudden has exploded to fill the gap. One of the things we think about when we think about mental health is, let's say we were to look at the bell curve, and that bell curve was human happiness is the x-axis, and on the right are like Buddhist monks who can burn themselves and don't worry about it, and then on the left side is like people who are institutionalized throwing their feces at guards in the prison, right? We were only really we're only setting up the healthcare for the left side of that tail. So that's what we funded, and we don't fund it very well, right? But we fund enough of it, and then there's some through the industry insurance sector. But are they really going to pay for people to feel perfect? No, they're not going to do that, and they've shown us they're not going to do that because they know depression patients can't fight back. It's hard to go to court if you're depressed and sue Blue Cross for 10 years, right? People do that for their kids' cancer. They don't do that for their depression, and they've known that. So if you think about it, you say, what if you rethought the industry this is like plastic surgery. It's elective. It's basically, people get boob jobs to feel better all the time, and they spend $5,000 for it. Why wouldn't you basically be willing to do that to get out of misery? And patients are absolutely willing to do that. Increasingly, psychiatrists are
Absolutely.
going to cash pay models.